So for those of you who are as excited as I am, I want to say that for people that I begin to discuss art and language with, I always say that they are the Rolling Stones of conceptual art. And I don't think that you will disagree with me. It's really a great pleasure to have Mel and Michael here on the stage with Guillaume. Bravo, bravo. Thank you for coming. I had to convince them on a rather maudlin day in the Oxfordshire countryside. I said, listen, guys, I have a gig for you. And they both looked at me and I said, that good news and bad news. The good news is we're going to make a symposium about art and language. And they rolled their eyes, not another one, not another symposium. And I said, and the bad news is it's a transatlantic flight to Chicago. And they looked at me and they said, we'll think about it. So several weeks later, I called from Paris and I said, how's the thinking going? Well, we haven't made any plans yet. So I'm very happy to report that they decided to join us here in Chicago, and I think the last time they were here was in 2008 for an exhibition at Rona Hoffman Gallery, and there is new work of theirs in the 40th anniversary show. So for those of you who are going to get a chance to visit Rona's gallery, you'll see new paintings, and here in the fair we have old work from 1966 that hasn't been seen in 40 years in stand 127. In René Schmidt's, I'm sorry, this is a little bit friends and family advertising, but I think it's important. René Schmidt has done the brave job of making a brand new portfolio of prints, editions that actually look like works on paper, and that's just around the corner. And so, without further ado, let's start talking with Mel and Michael. I wanted to just say, for those of you who don't know them, they started working together in the 60s, and maybe Mel, would you say a few words about how you first met and how art and language in those early days was beginning?
Is this on?
It's on, yeah.
Okay. Well, we didn't meet until quite late 60s, so quite a lot of the work that you see here was produced independently of one another. One has to remember that what is called conceptual art was not a body of... can you not hear me? Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, I beg your pardon. I was worried about distortion. Well, it wasn't. There was no body of conceptual thought, as Alain Rob Grillet once said about Roland Barthes. There were a series of commonalities and socialities which, or things which came together as socialities, but quite a lot of commonalities in the 60s, which were associated with the pressures that were put on artists by the late modernistic hegemony, the implications of minimal art and various other developments in the earlier 1960s. And the various young artists responded to these pressures in sort of similar ways, although with, I think, cognitively very distinct aspects. Mel and I first met, I mean, he can probably remember it better than I can, actually. I mean, actually we first met at any length in circumstances where he was in refuge from an unfortunate love affair and stayed at my house.
And that was in London or New York, guys?
It was in the country, in Oxfordshire.
Geez, Jill. I'm not going to go into that or any other anecdote of the time.
No, please don't. I wasn't trying to expose you.
I'm not going to do that. How did we meet? Well, I lived in New York and Michael lived in Hawley in Oxfordshire. And I think one of the reasons we met is that there was a I worked with another guy, a guy called Ian Byrne, and we first encountered the magazine Art Language when Seth Seaglob gave Ian Byrne, or showed Ian Byrne, a copy of it. And it was a magazine that was really nicely printed. It wasn't a piece of mimeographed crap. It was hot type. It was really impressive looking magazine, very nicely produced. And Ian Byrne and I wanted to write for this magazine, so we got in touch with a friend of Michael's called Terry Atkinson, and we started writing with this magazine because we were doing similar kind of work, not entirely similar, because ours wasn't nearly so complicated as the stuff that was being produced in England. So that was in that was in '69. So things kind of just developed from there, and eventually I used to leave New York every 6 months to come back to renew my visitor's visa. So I had to go back and forth to England quite a lot. And during that time, I had the unfortunate love affair, and I went to stay with Michael, and so things just kind of started from there. And it was important all the time from the very beginning that we saw ourselves not just necessarily with each other, but working in a collaborative way. It seemed very important. Now, I don't know why that's important, but I think one of the reasons why I couldn't write. So if I did a piece of writing, I used to give it to someone who could write slightly better. So during that period, it was pointless to put one name on things. We put two names on things, and the collaborative process just started from there. And it got more and more complicated, and different work took place. And that's it.
And did you go back to New York in that moment, or did you stay in?
No, I didn't stay in his house for 10 years.
No, but I mean,
Yeah, I went back to New York in 1971, and I stayed in New York and did work in New York, and then in 1977 I left and I came back to England permanently, and we've really been working
since then.
Since then, and this is really anecdotal.
That's all right.
You know.
There's nothing wrong with a few anecdotes sprinkled in. All right. So
what then happened was that we were involved in, and this really, you know, I'm a little reluctant to rehearse this history, but subsequently, in collaboration with Joseph Gassouth, we were involved in Documenta 10, produced a, what?
5.
5, Christ. Oh yeah, 5. Well, we were involved in Documenta 10, but it was much later. Anyway, involved Documenta 5.
This was the first index.
Which involved quite a large collaborative exercise, a highly discursive indexical operation. And in a way, that operation gave rise to quite a large group of adherents in New York, which developed and went on until the mid-1970s, until in one way or another, between ourselves, we killed it as it became, you might say, discursively untenable. There wasn't enough clarity in the social circumstances to be able to hear anyone's voice. And at that point, or a little later, began to collaborate with the Red Crayola on musical projects, and then a little later Mel moved to the UK, and we have worked together this 40 years, more or less every day, since then. I mean, will that do for a positive account?
I should say one thing. What Michael was saying, I'm just following up on something Michael was saying, that the really important breaking up and enabling thing of art and languages was this work that was shown at Documenta, the Index 01. That really changed everything. It changed art and language. It became a kind of office, a kind of conceptual art office. That's what the Documenta Index seemed to generate. Previous to that, the work had been collaborative, but it had always been on smaller scale articles or works of some kind or another. The Documenta index drew the attention to the collaborative process and analysing that collaborative process, or at least trying to ask questions about it.
I would say that the work for Documenta was the culmination of the period before. And in a funny way, the works from the 60s, Mel, when you were in New York doing your work, and Michael and Terry were making the certificate paintings, which we have here, there were parallel practices.
A long time before that, yeah.
Parallel practices, in a sense, moving in parallel, but not totally opposing spheres of interest and thinking and analysis. And that by the time in 72, when you were working with Bischofsberger and then Templon and the early shows of the 70s before the Documenta Index, there was already this internal motor beginning. And from that internal motor, the index came into being with this analytical, newfound group analytical.
In a way, I mean, I actually sort of sat and devised it on paper, in fact. I mean, it didn't arise from a much of an esprit de corps. It arose largely as something that seemed like an interesting circumstance in which to place ourselves, and to create a sort of infrastructure in order to place ourselves in that rather strange position. Certainly, as artists, it was a rather odd circumstance in which to place our identities, so to speak.
I think one thing to emphasize, I think, about the early work of art language during the 60s, or during, up to the early 70s, was that it was fairly obvious in the 1960s that you could do anything as an artist. You could call anything art. You could take a crap on the floor and you could call it art. It didn't matter. And one of the things, and obviously conceptual artists took that notion that you could do anything, but I think in the case of art language, there was a slight difference in the sense that if someone says anything can be art, I think one underlying thing that drove the art language work was that how come anything can be art? How come someone can come up and say, this is art? Who are they? And I think that, which is sometimes called analytical conceptual art, didn't last very long, but that was a kind of driving force that caused a lot of this collaborative work to come together in art and language, what art and language became.
But that's in a way to ask a question, and rather a you might say sort of voice off sort of question of the by then prevailing so-called institutional theory, which had begun to hold sway. Well, we all know that institutional theory presupposes an art world. One of the more interesting things about the way that the institutional theory conceives of an art world is that it does not conceive of it easily as a thing overdetermined by other social, historical, and political factors. It tends to sort of see it rather abstractly. And one of the questions we were motivated to ask was, okay, we have to accept the institutional theory with all its attendant circularities, but at the same time, among its implications are this and so, and these implications may be to do with actually what the art world is composed of, historically, politically, and so forth. And that is something that perhaps we have to raise some questions about. We cannot simply accept its benign bestowal of status upon us gratefully. We had better start wondering how we can sort of ask some questions of that, the things which are, of which it is created, which are not internal to it. And that maybe was one of the aspects of the index which operated to ask the sort of questions that Mel was adverting to. But it essentially, one has to remember that the so-called institutional theory, it had been around for quite a while, but it wasn't naturalized to the art world in the 1960s, and not necessarily just with the Duchampian dispensation, but with others, with minimal art and with in the work and discourse of people like Don Judd, who had a profound influence on me, for example, in terms of writing style and things like that. That made no sense. You're looking at me quizzically.
No. I'm thinking about the emergency conditionals, because this leap towards the index.
That's a different issue.
Yes, but at the same time, the curiosity that took you into the notion of indexing, of taking of knowledge that could be sorted by this or that fashion, or I mean, this is before computers, this is before Google, this is before the old-fashioned encyclopedia was the way in which knowledge was a compendium of information. But and this also goes back to what Guillaume was saying in the previous panel, that there was this curiosity and this intellectual edge that went from the different types of works you were doing separately into this joint a pilgrimage towards understanding different kinds of knowledge, and whether or not art had a relationship on the edges to those disciplines. And I think this is where art and language, qua art and language, is often seen this jumping off point of the Documenta index, and that was so shocking and nobody really could understand it at the time. But this is significant.
But the question of the emergency conditional TM is that it addresses quite an ordinary question, which is in the 1960s we were all producing these fragments, these quasi-theoretical fragments, these little variations and variations about variations and so forth, and there were questions to be raised about its relationship with other textual forms, with literature, with art, and with philosophy, with theory, and so forth. And the idea of an emergency conditional was devised, if you like, in order to answer those questions, in order to demonstrate that this was possibly a new genre, but at the same time it was a new genre whose differentiae were very unstable. It's a very
so that if it wasn't this, it could be that.
It was art, just in case it was theory, and it was theory just in case it was art, and so on. That's the conditional.
Yes, but I mean, this was also, every time you opened, there was this...
But that's a strange thing to suggest
that there's a link
will
between
compose the differentiae of a genre, something so unstable.
I think the first time I saw the index was at the Whitechapel, and I can't remember in which year, in the early 90s perhaps. It was, and this desperate...
It was very badly displayed.
It was terribly displayed.
And the people who own it locked all the cabinets so nobody could read what was inside it, so completely negating the whole point of the index.
Exactly, but I was...
Like protecting their private property.
But I remember the frustration, and we were talking about frustration before in Guillaume's conversation about the tools of art and language for a curator, but I remember standing there in the Whitechapel, and I think this was the first big work of yours that I had seen, and I was desperately curious to open the file drawers. And when the guard wasn't looking, I was trying, and then I thought, well, this is really lousy. You can't, because I knew that what was inside was important to the subject matter. But in any case, I think this move towards putting information in certain places and the charts on the wall with the binary systems, and it was a completely different kind of art form than what had been seen before, and it really shook the art world at that moment.
I don't know whether it shook anybody, but it gave rise to quite a lot of projects of various kinds, yes. But I don't know whether it shook anybody. I think it baffled more people than it shook.
Well, baffled.
Put out more people.
People just said it was a Stalinist reading room.
Yeah.
I mean,
Something we've always clung to desperately, the idea
Well,
that we once produced a Stalinist reading room. Seems our only real claim to glory, in fact.
I have to say something. No, I just, for those who was not there before, no, I'm not going to repeat it. No, just when I was listening to you now, I just, because we never met before, so you don't know me. I know you, but not personally, and you don't know my work. But as a curator, I just realized why I'm so fond of your work, actually. Because I really think, I might be wrong, but I really think that art is a problem for you. And art has always been a problem for me. And it's still a problem. And when you begin and saying that, you know, at the time with conceptual art, it was a time where you could do whatever, and then this whatever thing for certain artists, it's okay. Then it's easy, and then it's comfortable. And for others, maybe like you and others, so the problems begins in a way. Mm-hmm. The problems begin. And then I think that I was always very impressed by the art people who are living in this very easy, like a fish in the water, like everything is normal, everything is obvious, everything is evident. And the artists that I love, and I feel that you are part of it. It's artists for whom art is still a problem.
There's pain involved.
There is no evidence. There is nothing, and you have also to fight again, because then it becomes evident, and the artwork is, yeah, it's normal. You like, you don't like, okay. Yeah, it's just an opinion, let's say, you know. But then the essence même of the why this object is here, and especially with conceptual art, with this kind of fake freedom of you can do whatever, give you new responsibilities in a way. And I really think when I hear you talking about instability, uncertainty, that maybe if your work has been able to have this long career and continuing today, that we are not mentioning like other artists that you know that, okay, there is the piece of 68, and then, you know, a lot of artists, and I know as a curator that I contacted artists who are very bored about being asked always the same piece since 40 years. And for you, if you maybe were able to continue and to be so sharp till now, it's because maybe it continues being a problem. So you have to continue fighting against for trying to avoid this the evidence or this easiness or this comfort of the arts. So and I, as I said before, the curator, I thought you were like friends in a way, or familiar to me, because we are fighting not with the same forms or not with the same activity, but on the same problems. So we are maybe together, kind of troop fighting to not let the things become natural, let's say.
Yeah, curators are really much more interesting than artists. It's finally admitting defeat after railing against that very notion for years and years and years. The management. But the more interesting people.
Yeah, but you mustn't forget that no, I hear you, but we mustn't forget that it was conceptual art insofar as it had any or acquired any quasi-official status by the early 1970s, in which we began to see the sidling of the artist closer and closer to the management. The artist began slowly to work more and more and more in the light of the institution, and the interests of the artist and the determinations upon the artist increasingly began to be precisely identified with this, the determinations upon and the determinations provided by the institution. They began to become more and more inseparable. We began to see this in the early 1970s, and it is one of the reasons why we sought to revisit some new or some virtual spaces that could be created by, for example, acting as painters or as lyricists or as other engaging with other sorts of genre, which in essence were kind of fictions which we were able to try to operate within. And it was paradoxically our sort of operations within conceptual art which alerted us to the very insecurities of and absurdities of a nevertheless highly workable institutional theory, and which at the same time saw us put in danger of participating in something which eventually degenerated into the mere ornamentation of the institution. We had to find ways to resist that best we could. That involved stepping sideways and stepping outside any sense of a purifiable conceptual art or oeuvre in any sense at all.
But I often think that this conceptual oeuvre was, in your minds, a much bigger place than the conventional artist studio, and that in fact the activities involved with your conceptual oeuvre were so vast that they took you from the studio to the Jackson Pollock bar, to the lyrics with the Red Crayola, that the idea of the studio practice was almost musical, that it was something that existed without objecthood but as sound.
The only thing about a studio practice, apart from the ordinary conventional technical considerations, is that a studio, in the way we conceive it, is a dark place.
Deliberately so.
We work from a dark place and utter it to some degree into the light. I mean, and it's not simply that we have to have a dark place because we frequently fuck up, because we definitely do that from time to time. But also it's important to have this dark place because otherwise the light of the institution or the light of the art world, whatever that is, shines upon us and increasingly makes the dialogue complicit within its interests and its determinative powers, and the dark place to a degree enables us to resist that. It also has a cost, because working in a dark place, of course, means that you tell people to fuck off rather more often than you might if you were working in the light of the institution.
That doesn't mean to say that the work stays in a dark place, because what's extremely important to us is the work that we do in collaboration with other people, such as the Red Crayola, such as the Jackson Pollock Bar. That's of equal importance, and that seems to me the way that we get things back. We certainly got things back from what Matthew Jesse Jackson just did. Christ, a hard act to follow as usual. So it is a dark place, but it's not a place of, well, a dark place, of course, is a place of hiding in a way, is it not? Or is it just a way of protecting ourselves from the kind of institutional light that we're in right now?
No, I think the question of the dark is, yeah, I would say it might be a kind of protection and a kind of protecting from being too much I don't know, not influenced but touched by the unimportant things, maybe, you know.
I think what Michael's really saying is that it's a way of failing. It's a way of protecting, making ludicrous projects that you don't know whether they'll come to any fruition, that you just keep doing these things, and sometimes they screw up and sometimes they don't, but they can screw up.
And
Well, you can write
have to have the
essays in
freedom
dark
for that.
places, and utter the essays out of those dark places. But also there's a sense in which a dark place, insofar as we have any critique, any viable critique of the current dispensation in the art world, whatever that is that there's a sense in which from a dark place you can, as it were, hack. I don't mean hack in a literal IT sense, but there's a sense in which you can insert and, as Matthew adverted, infect and use little aspects of the Verfremdungseffect on people and so on and so on. That's what a dark space allows you to a certain degree.
But the dark place also, as I was discussing with Stephanie yesterday, one of the curious things about art and language is that in some ways the dark place is very real and vivid, and it's given you a lot of privacy and separation from an art world that is extremely public and intrusive. And yet in this seclusion, it's almost as if it's Clark Kent that everybody walks by until one moment he dons his Superman cape and he starts to fly. One has the feeling that your life in the studio is in this dark place, and we don't see you for months at a time, and some people don't see you for a decade at a time, and then there's a cape and a...
Is that when are we being Clark Kent? And we're being Clark Kent.
I think you're Clark Kent in the studio, yes. I think that you're just, you're going through the very deliberate, practical aspects of daily life in the studio.
Probably Clark Kent in the studio and Clark Kent outside the studio.
I think you're pretty much like Superman outside of the
I don't
studio.
think we ever get our underpants on the outside.
Clark Kent.
I think that it's pretty much Superman as art and language. I mean, I think that when it's not a persona that you aspire towards, but the work reveals a kind of exuberance and often this...
Confusion.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does, and it can be a confused exuberance. I mean, but I think there's nothing self-deprecating in the structure of the process and the ongoing transformation of the process.
Well, the point is, if you will, and we often do it, as it were, assume guises, the guises of painters or lyricists or script writers for actors or whatever.
Yes.
I mean, if one assumes those guises, one is liable to become the victim of one's own irony, but one is also engaged in the production of one sort or another of a sort of possible worlds, fictional spaces, in which you operate, and you sometimes you can't always choose you don't really know how to get out of those spaces once you've entered them. And one of the things about a studio or a dark place is that it's that place into which you can, as it were, bail out from the odd misconceived fictional circumstance in which one is generated. But I'm quite concerned at the idea that all we are sort of naysayers and Jeremiahs about the possibilities that exist in art. I mean, we may indeed, Jesse Jackson is right in suggesting we have very little to say in favour of the Enlightenment project, but equally, we probably have very little to say in favour of the many of the alternative projects to the Enlightenment project, are projects which tend towards faith and superstition. And we have very little positive to say about those. So where we sit in relation to the necessary critique of some of the ramifications of the Enlightenment project, insofar as it's found itself instanced in the art world, is a good question. But I really don't know. I mean, I don't know where, on how, really to theorize the question of autonomy, even though that always remains a kind of distant and possibility, something which appears to offer a kind of solution to the difficulties which we're currently encountering with this institutional, corporate sort of artistic culture that we are encountering in this very building. But I don't know. I don't. When Matthew made that assertion, I think he's right, but at the same time, I'm not entirely sure I know where we're standing.
But I think that
Sans
that lack of
positive
certainty
account.
of where you're actually standing is
Well,
what
I'm standing in
gives
the midst
work
of a
its-
negative account.
Yeah,
you
but it
understand?
gives the work its buzz, I would say.
Or a skeptical
This
account.
skepticism and discomfort. I mean, going back to, Guillaume, what you were saying, which is that it's a discomfort, it's an uncomfortable life to take art seriously. I mean, and to really throw yourself against art history and to throw yourself against life every single day in the studio is not something necessarily that is
Well, sometimes we do it half asleep. You know, I mean, sometimes it's a bit more bumbling than the sort of heroic effort of here's Mel and Michael going down the studio again. You know,
And quite frequently,
but there are those days.
sometimes we
and
just
quite-
don't say anything to each other all day. You know,
and quite frequently, it doesn't involve taking art very seriously at all, but seeing the joke, or finding art utterly hilarious from time to time. I mean,
we used to have this thing about how we'd be conceptual artists during the week and amateur art landscape painters during the weekend, and that we could do that because there's a lot of the amateur in conceptual art, certainly in art language conceptual art.
But
A lot of the amateur.
I always
And the
liked that,
autodidact,
yes.
of course. But, you know, I mean, a lot of those philosophical texts, I'll say this one for myself, you know, I bought a book on by Rudolf Carnap, and I thought that was it. I didn't have to do any more work. I'd just read this book and write stuff down. Right? But, I mean, it was hopelessly amateur. And a lot of the early work, I speak for myself, Michael, if I may, I didn't know what I was doing. I was completely hopeless. The work didn't have an audience. The work did not face an audience. The work, even in the 1970s, when Philippe Pilkington was working at Coventry, with you at Coventry College of Art, and I said this to him the other day, and I said, Charles's work had an audience. He knew what it was. Our work didn't have an audience, and Philippe said that was exactly the point. It did not have an audience. It had an audience of who you could reach out to, who you could see today, and that was it. And nobody else was interested. And I don't think they still are in a lot of that work.
Well, I think this is the paradoxical position in which you find yourselves today, isn't it?
and the paradox would be what? That
Of
made of what?
having this view of in the hostage paintings, I aim to be amateur, and
Well,
that
it's- yeah,
the
but when-
virtue of
when-
amateurism is something that you can
Ah, yes,
only
but-
write
but
about
that's
or
not-
imagine if
that's-
you're not an amateur.
But
It's
well,
a bit of a professional indulgence to think you're an amateur.
well,
of
no,
course.
I think there is the idea of the professional critic, for that matter, the professional artist, is one which has, in many ways become something that is all too predictable, all too lacking in independence, all too dependent in various ways. I mean, you know, Derrida gave up working on Hegel with Hippolyte because he saw philosophy as falling into the hands and only falling into the hands of institutional interests and so forth, and carried on with his whatever he was, you know, his later stuff, later essays and stuff. There have been other critics who've recognised that the virtuous literary critic, for example, is very rarely a professional. That in a way, the literary critic probably has to aspire to the condition of the amateur. So, I mean, one of the things that our amateurishness and inexpertise of the 1960s and so forth attests to is a kind of independence, which is, I guess, today not even conceivable in many ways, because information is transmitted with such vastly greater efficiency, and communication is so much quick and judgment made conceivably on slightly different bases. I mean, very instant questions of consumability or whatever are made. In the 1960s and early 70s, that there was a much less rapid turnover and a much more of a possibility of a kind of continuing in on a furrow, ploughing a little furrow, without necessarily having to recognise all the other furrows that it was connecting to and people were laying claim to, until you were ready to do that. The point about the index was it did suggest that nevertheless, notwithstanding these little narrow furrows, they were connected to others in some way. But the independence that was possible for young fellows in the 1960s is not something, I don't know how anybody would discover the equivalent now. At the same time, it still seems to me to remain a kind of desirable condition for anyone who would be critical, to have some, as it were, to aspire to something close to the condition of the amateur. And I don't mean the gentleman amateur or the lady amateur. I mean the amateur in the sense of the person not functioning in an entirely professional capacity, taking risks. I mean,
should we open the floor up for questions?
We should. We have time for a few questions, and I also just wanted to let everybody know that we're going to be distributing a free copy of emergency conditionals for everybody in the audience.
Great.
So
Fabulous.
expect
Questions?
a special publication. All right, one moment.
Thanks very much for being here in person. And I've got a question about how you see your work has, how the grounds have shifted over the course of since your work began. I'm thinking specifically of like the power of the institution versus, say, for instance, the power today. The institution is more like Facebook is Instagram, and so that there isn't that sort of great control necessarily coming from one spot, or it's being shared in some way. And I think that, as you said, sort of like another example of that is sort of the beautiful quote about the curators being more interesting than artists. Like how do you see current times and from when you began?
That's a really good question, and it's a really big question, and I don't know whether when I think about what the times were like, whether I knew what the times were like, when we began. I don't know if I did. So it's quite hard to answer that, because I think that some of the stuff that, some of the descriptions that I have about the way things were when we began, I made up yesterday, so I'm not sure. But it's fairly obvious that since the 1960s, when there were very few artists, really compared to today, very few institutions, very few galleries, and now there are thousands everywhere. And also because it's all become more corporate, and someone brought money in, somewhere, a lot of money came in. And the whole institutional framework of art has become so over-bloated. I don't know, it's just expansionist. It's expanding and expanding and expanding. And everything the artist does, or the artwork does, contributes to that expansion. And it's terrifying. I mean, and the way things were back in the 60s, I don't know whether they were any different or not. They were smaller.
Yeah, but does that answer the question about the power of social media in this context? I'm all at sea in relation to that, since I have almost no personal experience of that world. At the same time, it must have some very powerful bearing upon the dialectic, the internal dialectic of the institution. I mean, it must be, but is it dialectic or is it noise? I don't know. I don't know where the institution, it seems to me, is. I mean, we can take a very, very simple sense of it, that we can't. Capitalism is still operating. The real foundation is still there, and these increasingly powerful distributive forms are just that. They're increasingly powerful. How you find ways to resist the no truth, anti-epistemic kind of world that it creates, I'm not sure. Or whether at certain levels and in certain circumstances one has to seek ways to embrace that. I don't know. I'm not very, I feel very confident to expatiate on that.
You often refer to you've often referred to the word lyricist, and how does lyricist fit into the conceptual art? And how does it remain abstract if it's on for 30 years he's been a conceptual artist that nobody knows about? So it was interesting for me to hear you use that term as it also relates to what he does. So I appreciate your observation.
Hi. First, when you said you had been called Stalinists, it recalled the tension between Walter Benjamin, who saw some emancipatory potentials in the new technologies that emerged with mass society, whereas Adorno and Horkheimer wrote this terrifying dialectic of enlightenment, where the whole thing gets crushed by commercial capitalism. And I think Benjamin won in the long run, and that there's so many diversities in expression and creative uses of mediums of all kinds, that in effect, the revolution that you started in the 60s has become much more diverse than the original dialogue captures. So, we owe you something. But what I noticed in this presentation is that you had a beautiful woman in heels, enslaved to an office machine, presenting your text, which was orchestrated with a very structured piece of classical music. And I wanted to scream, kick off your shoes and run, because that was her only role in this entire presentation, was window dressing. And I mean, 68 was the year of feminism.
It wasn't our presentation.
And feminism is still a relevant project in the art world.
Absolutely, but it wasn't our presentation. That was not our work. That was work by somebody else.
Okay.
And very good it was too.
Yeah.
Then
I'm sorry, but
I'm sorry the way the lady had.
That just
the lady
struck
had
me right on the head. You're talking about unstable objects, unstable texts, unstable situations. If you'd both come up and stripped naked and read your manifesto, you would have shaken the world, because we don't want to see the bodies of elders. We don't want to see real people sweating it out.
response, or do you want to go to the next question? Maybe, perhaps. Is there another question in the audience? Yes.
You know, you talk about the dark space, and as a practicing artist who is in a studio by myself most of my life, and is being asked to produce, you know, this for that show or this for that show, and under great time pressures and family pressures and economic pressures and all those other types of pressures and things not working out well. And it gets very dark there. But I think that's a very great analogy, because out of the darkness does come the light. And you have to really, sometimes really dig down deep to be able to bring forth something that has some level of significance. So the dark space is a very relevant space, I think, and it is a space that carries a tremendous amount of historical reverence. And I think it's, I'm glad you said that, because it has a lot of significance to my personal self, but I also think it has a lot of reverence to anybody who actually practices deeply in the space and kind of shuts the world out to find that area where there's no speak except there's no. So I'm just wondering if I'm perhaps seeing that correctly, or if that's my own analogy, but.
I don't know. I mean, do you mean that the dark space is also a place that you can, as it were, enter the world in disguise, or from which the world can't, out of which you can emerge without being seen? I'm not quite sure what you're saying. No, I can't see the person. I can't see because of the light shining directly in my eyes. I still can't.
Do you see it as a place of birth, of new discovery, the dark space? Do you see it as a place where...
Oh, it's not this kind of... It seems to have collapsed into a kind of romanticism. And, you know, I mean, the studio as a kind of manufacturing place is an old bloke's idea of... I know you're not a bloke. An idea of a place to work, you know, and studios are not very fashionable. People don't need studios anymore. People have laptops. We have a dealer in Germany who was amazed when he came to the studio that there were saw machines and timber, because most of the conceptual artists that he knows just have a laptop. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know.
I don't know what that's got to do with the dark space.
I don't know where
just
I'm going.
easily turn
I don't
that
know
into
where I'm
something-
going with answering this
something
question.
in the light.
No, but if I may add something about this question of the darkness of the studio, I personally not sure that the functionment of it is like the dark studio, and suddenly the piece out of the studio becomes visible and clear, and it will be almost the contrary. Actually, I was thinking that maybe the studio is clearer, and when the piece is going out of the studio, then it becomes it brings the darkness with it in a way, and that's my relationship. There is a very interesting psychiatrist called François Toscales, who's one of the fathers of anti-psychiatry, who say this very beautiful thing about the idea that in order to be understood, in order to be not understood, but to have a relation with someone, you have to be a stranger. You have to. So there is always the part of he say that he doesn't understand why in the Western world or in the let's say Christian world there is the idea of the Babel as a sin. You know, when people talk different language, then it's a sin. It's a problem. And he say that in other culture it's a solution. creation. That they say that in the Islamic world there is surats. They say that God created several languages in order that the people have relation together. And without being a stranger, I cannot. If I'm not a stranger, I cannot translate you. Then I don't have any relationship with you. So any relationship needs a distance, needs a misunderstanding, and needs that. And that's what I think is that when the piece or when the work goes out of the studio, suddenly it becomes more problematic in a way. And maybe the darkness is here. I mean, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but the point, you're right about this, in the sense of being a degree of clarity as a consequence of the existence of this dark place. Because one of the obvious things which the artist working in the light is engaged in is in a very a circumstance in which the light occludes the very interests and determinations that are operating on the people involved. I mean, on the agencies involved. The fact that it looks like the light is not, in fact, an indication that it's owning up to the determinations that are bearing within it and upon it.
And I think that conceptual art in general, not only Europe, but in general, played a lot about that signs of intelligence, obviously pretending, showing everything, and but at the end, when you go further, very often when you go really deep inside, or when you finally there's not much to see, and I as a spectator of conceptual art, I come from that fascination without checking, what is inside, what is behind, and when you check, sometimes you can lose a lot actually. So and it happened to me on several occasions when I was working, and I was very fond of, I don't know, for example, Adrian Piper schematic work from the beginning of her career, which was wonderful. And when I had to work on that as a curator, I decided, okay, now that's 10 years that I love it, but I never really checked what it was about actually. So I went to go further inside and see, checking like almost an accountant, checking, is it correctly, the diagrams correctly fitting the protocol, And then at the end I realized three things. At first, it was not so complex that I thought, and suddenly I was almost the only one to have checked that, because when I talked to people who knew much more this work, I realized that they didn't really know what it was about. And at the end, the piece was not more interesting this way, actually, So the surface diagram was, and I think index your first piece, index 1, was a piece that I quoted, that was important for me, and I didn't even experience the piece because I saw it only in pictures. And maybe it was in the Phaidon edition of Conceptual Art, when there were wonderful pictures. So for me, it's a picture, it's a representation, so there is a surface. Anyway, this piece had an effect. Although I didn't open the how do you call the drawers and checking there, but I trust you. It's fine. I trust you that there was a real clever, wonderful text inside, and I understand. But this distance for me is essential. Yeah.
But a lot of people consumed that index, I'm sure, as a sort of metal minimal object. I'm not sure how I feel about that.
We're out of time for this conversation. Thank you all. And stick around. So right now we're having the third panel of the symposium.